The telemetry screen bled red. 7,000 hostile dreadnoughts clouded Earth's atmosphere, blotting out the sun. In the sterile halls of the Galactic Council, delegates prepared their generic condolences for a dead species. They expected a slaughter. They got one, just not the one they bargained for. The climate control in the Galactic Council observation chamber hummed at a perfect, unchanging frequency. It was a room designed to strip the emotion out of watching civilizations end. The lighting was soft. The seats were ergonomically flawless, molded to accommodate the varied anatomies of the 50 ruling delegates. Arthur, the presiding High Delegate, adjusted his cuffs and took a slow sip of synthetic tea. It was lukewarm. He hated when it was lukewarm. Below him, spanning a screen the size of a city block, the Sol system played out in high-definition telemetry. "Update the grid," Arthur said, his voice a low, bored rumble that barely carried over the muted chatter of the other delegates. Beside him, Beatrice tapped a manicured finger against a glass datapad. She was the Council's military liaison, a veteran of a dozen pacification campaigns that had ended with signatures on paper rather than blood in the dirt. "Grid updated," Beatrice replied. "The Sovereign Armada has crossed the orbital threshold of the 4th planet. They are bypassing the outer human colonies completely. Direct trajectory for Earth. Estimated time to atmospheric entry is 40 standard minutes." Arthur sighed. It was a heavy, put-upon sound. A shame. The humans were beginning to produce a rather decent grain export. Rough around the edges, entirely too loud in assembly, but useful. They refused the Sovereign's demands for tribute. It was inevitable, Beatrice stated, eyes locked on the expanding cluster of crimson blips on the screen. "You don't tell the Sovereign Armada to. What was the human phrasing? Shove it up your exhaust port without expecting consequences. Humanity was a Tier 9 species. They had scraped their way out of their gravity well a mere century ago, bolted some crude fusion drives to the backs of reinforced steel tubes, and loudly announced their arrival to a galaxy that entirely ignored them. The Council had granted them observer status, strictly as a formality. They had no real fleet. They had no planetary shields. They relied on kinetic weapons and localized nuclear detonations, primitive, messy technology that the rest of the galaxy had abandoned millennia ago. Now, 7,000 sovereign dreadnoughts were descending on their homeworld. The sovereign ships were sleek, shielded by layers of hard light and armed with plasma lances capable of turning a continent into a glass parking lot. It wasn't a war. It was a demolition project. Behind a pane of soundproof, reinforced glass in the upper gallery, Ambassador Hayes stood alone. He was the human representative to the Council. Protocol dictated that representatives of species under active orbital bombardment be quarantined for their own safety and the peace of mind of the Council. Arthur glanced up at the gallery. He expected to see Hayes weeping. He expected the human to be pounding on the glass, begging the Council to intervene, pleading for sanctions or a military blockade. Hayes wasn't moving. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his jaw set, his eyes fixed dead ahead on the massive tactical display. His knuckles were white, the muscles in his neck were drawn tight as wire, but his face was a mask of cold, unyielding stone. "He's taking it rather well," Arthur noted, turning back to his tea. "Shock," Beatrice diagnosed clinically. "Their brains struggle to process extinction-level events. Give it 20 minutes. When the first cities burn, he'll break." On the massive screen, the visual feed shifted from orbital telemetry to atmospheric cameras. The Council paid top credit for these feeds. Watching a planetary capitulation was a valuable learning tool for newer species. The feed showed a sprawling human metropolis. Chicago. The sky above it was a pale, polluted blue. Then, The blue was swallowed by iron. The sovereign dreadnoughts didn't drop out of the clouds. They became the clouds. The sheer mass of the descending fleet displaced the atmosphere, creating localized storm fronts. The camera captured the shadow rolling over the city, plunging millions of humans into sudden, unnatural twilight. Down in the streets, sirens began to scream. It was a low, gut-vibrating wail that bled through the audio receptors and echoed in the pristine council chamber. "Mute the local audio," Arthur ordered, waving a hand. "It gives me a headache." The chamber went silent again, leaving only the visual of millions of humans looking up at a sky entirely paved with weapons. "Standard sovereign doctrine," Beatrice murmured, taking notes. "They will fire a warning shot, a low-yield plasma strike on a major military installation. Then they will broadcast the surrender terms on all frequencies. The humans will capitulate within the hour to save their population centers." Arthur checked his timepiece. "Let's hope so. I have a luncheon with the Trade Federation in 2 hours." On the screen, the lead sovereign dreadnought opened its ventral bays. A sickening, brilliant purple light gathered in the focal rings of its main cannon. The first shot was fired. The plasma lance struck the Earth with the fury of a dying star. The visual feed aggressively filtered the light to prevent blinding the council members, dropping the exposure so low that the rest of the planet appeared pitch black. The beam slammed into a heavily fortified mountain range in the center of the North American continent. For 3 agonizing seconds, the mountain glowed. Then it simply ceased to exist. A shock wave of displaced earth, vaporized rock, and superheated air rolled outward, flattening thousands of acres of forest in an instant. The thermal bloom was a horrific, beautiful flower of absolute destruction. "Strike confirmed," Beatrice said, her voice remaining perfectly level. "NORAD installation eliminated. Sovereign Command is now broadcasting the demand for unconditional surrender." Arthur settled back into his chair, steepling his fingers. "Now we wait. Watch the human communication grid. We should see their global leadership transmitting the white flag code momentarily." 10 seconds passed. 30 seconds. A minute. The diplomatic frequencies remained entirely empty. No plea for mercy. No broadcast of surrender. Not even a demand for terms. Just a hollow, echoing silence. "Are their comms down?" Arthur asked, a slight frown creasing his forehead. "Negative," Beatrice replied, her fingers flying across her datapad, suddenly moving a fraction faster than before. "Their diplomatic channels are open and functioning. But—" She hesitated, a rare occurrence. "But what, Beatrice?" "Their tactical frequencies. They just spiked." "Spiked? To what degree?" "To all of them." On the massive telemetry screen, the tactical overlay activated. The council members, previously lounging and whispering among themselves, began to sit up. The map of Earth was suddenly crawling with tiny, rapidly moving blue dots. They weren't just concentrated around military bases. They were appearing everywhere. In the oceans, in the deserts, in the centers of civilian cities, in the remote, frozen wastelands of the poles. "What am I looking at?" Arthur demanded, abandoning his tea entirely. "Missile launches," Beatrice said, the clinical detachment in her voice finally cracking. "Hundreds of them. No, thousands. They are firing everything they have." "At shielded dreadnoughts?" Arthur scoffed, though his stomach gave a sudden, strange lurch. "It's suicide. Kinetic weapons and rudimentary nuclear warheads cannot breach sovereign hard light shields. They are throwing stones at a fortress. Down on the surface, Sergeant Miller didn't care about hard light shields. He was deafened by the roar of the massive, retrofitted mass-driver artillery piece he was currently feeding. The sky above his battery in the Nevada desert was burning, the air so hot it blistered his lungs with every breath. "Load the next one!" Miller screamed over the deafening mechanical shriek of the autoloader. Beside him, David, a kid barely out of basic training, his face streaked with grease and blood from a blown eardrum, slammed the heavy kinetic slug into the chamber. It wasn't a precision weapon. It was a 2-ton tungsten rod strapped to a chemical rocket. "Clear!" David shrieked. Miller slammed the firing stud. The ground bucked violently. A column of fire punched a hole in the clouds, racing upward into the dark belly of the sovereign ship hanging above them. They weren't aiming for critical systems. They were just aiming up. In the council chamber, the view shifted to an orbital perspective. The Earth looked like a dying animal, bristling with defensive spines. Thousands of smoke trails reached up from the surface, converging on the 7,000 dreadnoughts. "Sovereign point defense is engaging," Beatrice reported. The alien ships lit up with thousands of pinpoint lasers, swatting the incoming human missiles out of the sky. 90% of the human ordnance detonated in mid-air, creating a spectacular, horrifying fireworks display that covered the entire globe in a blanket of radiation and fire. But 10% got through. A tungsten rod moving at Mach 15 slammed into the hard light shield of a dreadnought over Europe. The shield flared a brilliant, angry blue, holding firm, but then a second rod hit the exact same spot, then a third, then a crude, low-yield nuclear warhead detonated directly against the barrier. "Shield failure on Sovereign Vessel Vanguard," Beatrice whispered. Before the dreadnought could compensate, a dozen more kinetic slugs tore through the weakened barrier and slammed into the physical hull of the ship. The metal groaned, buckled, and shattered. The massive dreadnought listed heavily, its internal gravity failing, atmosphere venting violently into the upper atmosphere. A cheer did not erupt in the council chamber. Instead, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. The humans had drawn blood. Arthur looked up at the gallery. Hayes was no longer standing still. The human ambassador had stepped right up to the glass. He had placed one hand flat against the reinforced pane, and he was smiling. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was a feral, bloodless baring of teeth. It was the smile of a cornered predator that had just realized its teeth could pierce the hunter's armor. "They destroyed one ship," Arthur said, his voice tight. "The Sovereign Armada has 6,999 left. The humans have exhausted their surface-to-orbit payload." "High Delegate," Beatrice interrupted, her tone sharp. "Look at the orbital grid." Arthur pulled his eyes away from Hayes and looked at the screen. The blue dots weren't just coming from the surface anymore. Humanity had hundreds of orbital installations, refueling depots, commercial space stations, asteroid mining rigs, and communications satellites. The Council had ignored them. They were civilian infrastructure, unarmed and irrelevant. "They are firing their station thrusters," Beatrice said, staring in disbelief at the telemetry. "All of them. Simultaneously." "Are they trying to break orbit? Retreat?" "No," Beatrice said softly. The blood had entirely left her face. "They are altering their trajectories. They are overriding the collision avoidance protocols." The massive, sprawling commercial mining station Archimedes, hanging in low Earth orbit, suddenly burned its maneuvering thrusters to maximum capacity. It didn't fire a weapon. It became the weapon. With 2,000 human civilian workers still aboard, the station hurled itself directly into the path of a sovereign command carrier. The impact was cataclysmic. The sheer mass of the mining station overwhelmed the carrier's shields instantly. Millions of tons of steel, rock, and alien alloy crumpled together in a silent, blinding flash of kinetic energy. And they didn't stop there. Every single satellite, every piece of orbital junk, every cargo freighter, and every habitation ring ignited their drives. They weren't aiming for precise kills. They were aiming to die and to take the enemy with them. The telemetry screen turned into a chaotic blur of collisions. They're destroying their own orbital infrastructure, Arthur stammered, gripping the edges of his desk. The debris field. They are weaponizing Kessler syndrome, Beatrice finished, her voice hollow. In a matter of minutes, the space around Earth became an impenetrable blender of high-velocity shrapnel. Millions of fragments of shattered human stations and dead alien ships began tearing through the remaining sovereign fleet at orbital velocities. Shields flared and failed under the relentless, chaotic bombardment of their own pulverized debris. The sovereign dreadnoughts were trapped. If they stayed in low orbit, they would be shredded by the debris storm. If they dropped lower into the atmosphere, they would be sitting ducks for the continuous barrage of crude surface-to-air kinetic slugs. They are sealing themselves in, Arthur whispered, watching the red blips of the mighty sovereign fleet begin to blink out, one by one, swallowed by a meat grinder of humanity's own making. They are burning down their own house just to kill the intruders. Up in the gallery, Hayes rested his forehead against the glass. He wasn't looking at the alien delegates anymore. He was watching his home burn, trapped in a cage of its own shattered bones. The Galaxy Council watched in horror. They had expected a surrender. Instead, they were watching a species cheerfully commit planetary suicide, so long as their enemies died first. The tactical display in the council chamber was no longer a neat, organized grid of military assets. It had devolved into a swirling, chaotic storm of jagged metal and dying ships. The Kessler field, a runaway cascade of orbital collisions, was thickening by the second. Arthur watched a sovereign dreadnought, the resplendent sun, attempt a desperate maneuver. Its captain, realizing the trap, ordered a full-burn retreat toward the dark side of the moon. The ship's massive plasma drives flared, pushing the heavily armored vessel against the tightening net of shrapnel. It was a fatal miscalculation. The dreadnought's hard light shields were designed to deflect concentrated energy blasts and organized kinetic strikes, not the microscopic, relentless friction of 1 million shredded satellites moving at 30,000 miles an hour. A jagged chunk of the International Space Station, sheared off during the initial kamikaze wave, impacted the resplendent sun's primary thruster array. The shield sputtered and failed under the localized stress. The engine block detonated. The dreadnought spun violently out of control, careening back into the lower atmosphere where the human ground batteries were waiting. "They are firing again," Beatrice said, her voice stripped of its usual clinical authority. "The surface batteries. They aren't even targeting the hull." Down in the muddy trenches of an improvised artillery position outside London, Captain Lewis didn't care about the hull. He was screaming coordinates into a cracked radio handset, rain and mud plastering his hair to his skull. "Aim for the breach! Hit the glowing bits!" Lewis roared, slapping the shoulder of his gunner, a terrified kid named Carter. They weren't using advanced targeting computers. They were using math, gravity, and spite. Carter cranked the elevation wheel on the anti-air flak cannon. They had loaded it with scattershot, hundreds of pounds of jagged tungsten ball bearings. The resplendent sun fell through the clouds like a dying whale, its hull glowing cherry red from atmospheric friction. "Fire!" Lewis commanded. The cannon hammered the sky. The scattershot tore into the exposed, ruined engine block of the dreadnought. The internal fusion core, already unstable, ruptured completely. A flash of blinding white light consumed the sky, followed by a concussive shockwave that knocked Lewis and Carter flat into the mud. Debris rained down on the English countryside, burning chunks of alien metal plunging into the earth like meteors. Lewis dragged himself out of the muck, coughing up dust, and looked at the sky. He grinned, his teeth stark white against the grime on his face. Back in the council chamber, the casualty counter for the Sovereign Armada was ticking upward at an impossible rate. 3,000 ships lost, Beatrice whispered, staring at her datapad as if it were a venomous snake. 3,500. 4,000. The Sovereign fleet was breaking formation. Panic, an emotion strictly engineered out of their command structure, was rippling through their ranks. They were attempting to scatter, breaking the cohesion of their defensive grids to flee the orbital meat grinder. But humanity had anticipated that. "High Delegate," Beatrice said, pointing a trembling finger at the display. "The human moon colony, Artemis Base. They are venting their atmosphere." Arthur blinked, trying to process the sheer scale of the madness unfolding before him. Why? The Sovereign fleet isn't targeting the moon. They aren't under attack. They are using the atmospheric venting as a makeshift propellant. Beatrice's eyes widened. They've uncoupled the primary habitation ring. The colonists are still inside. They are using the station's remaining life support fuel to alter its trajectory. The telemetry confirmed her nightmare. A massive, spinning wheel of steel and glass, home to 50,000 human civilians, was slowly but inexorably drifting out of lunar orbit. It was moving to block the primary retreat vector of the Sovereign fleet. "They are building a wall," Arthur said, the realization settling like lead in his stomach. A wall of their own people. The Sovereign ships that had managed to claw their way out of the debris field found themselves facing a massive, slow-moving obstruction. They could vaporize it, yes, but the explosion would create a secondary debris field, effectively closing the corridor and trapping the rest of the fleet. The fleet commander hesitated. In that 3-second window of tactical indecision, the human habitation's ring detonated. They didn't wait to be fired upon. The colonists had overloaded their own localized fusion reactors. 50,000 souls vanished in a heartbeat, creating a wall of expanding plasma and shattered rock that completely sealed the retreat vector. The silence in the council chamber was absolute. The other delegates, species that had waged war for millennia, with strict rules of engagement, honor codes, and casualty limits, were paralyzed. They were watching an apex predator trapped in a cage with a cornered rat, only to discover the rat was wearing a suicide vest. 5,000 ships lost, Beatrice reported, her voice completely hollow. 6,000. The command carrier is gone. Admiral. She stopped, swallowing hard. The Sovereign command structure has been entirely decapitated. Arthur looked at the tactical map. Earth was unrecognizable. It was surrounded by a thick, ugly ring of pulverized metal, a tombstone made of orbital infrastructure and alien warships. The beautiful blue marble was scarred with the atmospheric burns of falling debris, but it was still there. "Bring up the diplomatic channels," Arthur ordered, his throat dry. "Contact the Sovereign High Command on their homeworld. Tell them—" He trailed off, unsure of what to even say. "They are already broadcasting," Beatrice said, "but not to us." The main screen shifted. The tactical overlay vanished, replaced by a visual feed from the Sovereign homeworld. The Sovereign Emperor, a towering, armored figure, was standing before his own council. He looked pale. "Pull the fleet back," the Emperor commanded, his voice trembling. "Cancel the pacification. Leave that cursed system immediately." "Emperor," a Sovereign tactical officer replied, his head bowed. "We cannot. The fleet is gone." The dust settled, both literally and metaphorically. The telemetry screen in the Galactic Council chamber returned to its low-power hum, displaying the Sol system in a quiet, grim stillness. Earth was now a planetary fortress wrapped in a shroud of razor wire. The Kessler field was a permanent, impenetrable barrier. Nothing was getting in. Nothing was getting out. Humanity had successfully quarantined themselves from the rest of the galaxy, using the shattered husks of a Tier 1 armada as their building material. Arthur sat slumped in his ergonomic chair. His synthetic tea was completely cold. He felt a deep, profound exhaustion sinking into his bones. He had presided over the assimilation of dozens of species. He had watched planets burn and empires crumble. But he had never seen anything like this. He looked up at the observation gallery. Ambassador Hayes was still standing there. He had finally stepped back from the glass. He was adjusting the cuffs of his suit jacket, smoothing out invisible wrinkles with calm, methodical precision. "Open a channel to the human representative," Arthur commanded softly. Beatrice nodded, tapping her datapad. A soft chime echoed in the chamber, and the soundproof barrier of the gallery was deactivated. Hayes turned to face the council. His expression was no longer feral. It was polite, composed, and utterly terrifying. "High Delegate Arthur," Hayes said, his voice echoing cleanly through the massive chamber. "I hope the telemetry feed was to your satisfaction. I understand the Council values accurate data on planetary defense mechanisms." Arthur leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. He stared down at the human, trying to find a trace of the trauma, the grief, the sheer psychic horror of what his species had just endured. He found nothing but cold, hardened steel. "Ambassador Hayes," Arthur began, his voice measured, "your world has survived. But at what cost? You have destroyed your own orbital infrastructure. You have trapped yourselves in a cage of debris. You have sacrificed millions of your own people in a display of tactical lunacy." Hayes offered a thin, humorless smile. "We didn't trap ourselves, High Delegate. We locked the door." Arthur frowned. "You have crippled your own civilization. It will take you a century to clear that debris field. You will be cut off from galactic trade, from council support, from the greater community." "Good," Hayes replied instantly. The word hung in the air, heavy and sharp. "The galaxy came to our doorstep with 7,000 dreadnoughts and demanded we bow. We declined. We don't want your trade. We don't want your support. And we certainly don't want to be part of a community that sits in comfortable chairs and watches while our cities are burned to ash." Beatrice stepped forward, gripping the railing of the council dais. "You cannot survive in isolation, Hayes. The Sovereign Empire will rebuild their fleet. They will come back. And next time, they won't demand surrender. They will simply crack your planet from a safe distance." Hayes let out a short, dry laugh. It was a sound devoid of any real amusement. "Let them try. Do you know what we are doing down there right now, Beatrice?" He pointed a finger at the telemetry screen, at the scarred, bruised blue marble spinning silently in the dark. "We aren't mourning," Hayes said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "We are scavenging. There are currently 7,000 ruined sovereign dreadnoughts floating in our upper atmosphere. 7,000 Tier 1 warships, packed with advanced plasma drives, hard light emitters, and localized fusion technology. It's broken, yes, but we are very, very good at putting broken things back together." A cold sweat broke out on Arthur's neck. The realization hit him with the force of a kinetic slug. Humanity hadn't just defeated the Sovereign Armada. They had stolen their technology. They had turned a genocide into a salvage operation. "You," Arthur stammered, his diplomatic composure finally fracturing. "You are integrating their weapons. We are reverse engineering everything," Hayes confirmed, his eyes locking onto Arthur's. "In 10 years, we won't need to strap tungsten rods to chemical rockets. We'll have plasma lances. We'll have hard light shields. We'll have a fleet." He walked slowly to the edge of the gallery, resting his hands on the railing. He looked down at the assembled delegates of the Galactic Council, a room full of ancient, powerful beings, who suddenly looked very small. "We are going to clear our orbit," Hayes said, his voice ringing with absolute, terrifying certainty. "And when we do, we are going to open the door. We are going to step out into the galaxy, and we are going to remember exactly who fired the first shot and who sat in the dark and watched." Hayes turned his back on the council. He walked toward the exit of the gallery, his footsteps echoing in the absolute silence of the chamber. He paused at the door, glancing back over his shoulder. "I suggest you update your grid, High Delegate," Hayes said softly. "The Tier 9 designation is no longer accurate." The heavy blast doors slid shut behind him, sealing with a final, echoing thud. Arthur sat in the silence, staring at the closed doors. He slowly turned his head to look at Beatrice. Her face was the color of ash. She was staring at the telemetry screen, at the ring of debris surrounding Earth. It wasn't a tombstone, it was a cocoon. "Meeting adjourned," Arthur whispered to the empty room. Down on the surface of Earth, beneath a sky choked with smoke and the burning wreckage of alien gods, humanity was already pulling themselves out of the mud. Captain Lewis stood over the shattered hull of a Sovereign interceptor, a plasma torch in his hand, a grim smile on his face. They had lost millions. They had burned their own sky. But they were still breathing, and they had work to do. If you enjoyed this descent into humanity's ruthless will to survive, hit that like button to keep the scrap metal flying. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another HFY Sci Fi adventure. What would you do if an alien armada showed up at your doorstep? Drop your battle plans in the comments below. Share this video with a fellow sci-fi fan, and until next time, keep your eyes on the stars and your powder dry.